Hello, everyone, and a very good evening to our esteemed guest speaker today, Dr. Albeena Shakil. Before giving a brief introduction about Professor Shakil, I'd like to give an introduction on what Azaad Awaaz is, what our aim is, and what we do. So, Azaad Awaaz is a digital media station which aims to highlight the issues faced by the marginalized and vulnerable within Indian society. It aims to tackle the questions of why things occur the way they do within society. And this month, the aim is on gender based violence, issues of identity, particularly based upon women, and the structural, indirect, and direct violence that they face. This discussion, conducted with Dr. Albeena Shakil, will focus on the more structural aspects of violence that women face within the workplace, considering that while most discussions look upon the physical violence inflicted upon women, social barriers are a very, very strong structure of the patriarchy, which do not help in uplifting women many of the times, and they have to combat it and struggle against it. So tonight's speaker this evening is Professor Albeena Shakil. She is a professor of English studies at Jindal University. Professor also taught gender and society, and therefore has a very strong understanding of the aforementioned issues. Along with that, Professor has a very lengthy list of accomplishments. So I suppose I will keep it very brief and say that we're very, very thankful to have someone like you as our speaker here tonight. And thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you so much, Natasha Yadav. And thank you to Azaad Awaaz. This initiative by Center for New Economic Studies is a very, very promising initiative. And thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Professor. So I suppose I will just begin with the questions. So as mentioned before, it will tackle the violence that women face within the workplace. And the first question is, Constitution laws on the prevention of women's harassment in principle with regards to their treatment in the workplace exist within India, such as the Sexual Harassment of Women at Workplace Prevention, Prohibition and Redressal Act. Despite existing, there is a lack of proper implementation and a plethora of issues women face within the workplace. What are the social and political issues faced by women, especially within their professional sphere?
So that's a tough question because it packs a lot of very, very important questions within it. So let me start by making a reference to a 1999 Status of Women report brought out by the United Nations. And to summarize what it said that women are over 50% of the world's population. They do 2/3 of the world's work, and we will return to that figure once again. They do 2/3 of the world's work. They earn 1/10 of the world's wages, and they own 1/100th of the world's property. So this is a report that was brought out in 1999. It's a controversial assessment by the report. Since then, many economists, many people who work with statistics and data collection have disputed this figure and said, no, it is a very rough approximation. It is not accurate. And yet, in many ways, this is a report that sort of summarizes what was the status of women at the turn of the century. And we know that since then, the figures for female employment have not improved by much. In fact, the trends have gone forward, have gone backward. So for instance, recently in India, there has been a lot of discussion that female labor participation rates have in fact fallen compared to a few years back. And of course, we don't have the post-pandemic figures at all with us. What has happened when there is a lot of retrenchment and a lot of people who are who have faced unemployment or who are now underemployed, who are not gainfully employed, who are sort of working below, or less or for less than what they would want to do or what their skill sets are. They're having to do different kinds of works to somehow make ends meet. So we know that when the post-pandemic figures become clearer and clearer, there are already reports from world over that women have been losing out. Now, to return to the question of sexual harassment at the workplace, so let me start with that, because the law, and you referred to the constitutional law, this is an act that got enacted in the year 2013. And this act got enacted by the parliament immediately after the anti-gang rape protests that started from Delhi in December 2012, after the fateful, and terrible gang rape and murder of a very young paramedic student who was out on the roads. And and just the travel back, even when accompanied by a male friend, the travel back to home, even at not in an unearthly hour, but a very earthly hour of just around 9 p.m. at night, resulted in so much damage that she lost her life. Of course, that gang rape and murder sort of prompted that very big movement. And it was very remarkable what happened in Delhi and elsewhere in the country during those couple of months, because suddenly it seemed that the entire country was discussing violence against women. And because the Justice J.S. Verma committee was constituted by the government, and they invited suggestions from people, that what should be done, what could be done. And it seems that within a period of 15 to 20 days that was open for suggestions, they got over 80,000 responses. So, it was a wide democratization of the issue of what to do, to prevent violence against women. Now, of course, there was and there is, I think, uh, a very big gap between what young people were asking on the streets in 2012 and 13, because a lot of young people were out on the streets. And it was a very, very healthy and welcome sign that a lot of young men were out on the streets, and they were matching women, if not sort of bettering them in the numbers. And that was very encouraging, because for decades we have seen only women being interested in women's issues, or reacting or protesting against violence against women. So one of the key demands that emerged was that in 1997 the Supreme Court of India had issued a guideline. Now, as you know, in law, a guideline is just a guideline, so it is not mandatory to implement it. And they had issued the famous guidelines in the case of Vishakha versus State of Rajasthan. And as you know, that entire case sort of emerged from the very, very unfortunate, and still, we have not seen the light of justice in that case, which is the gang rape of Bhavri Devi in Rajasthan. And Bhavri Devi was a person who belonged to the oppressed caste. She was employed by the government as a working woman, as a sathin. It was her job to prevent and report child marriage wherever it was happening. And she took the initiative when she saw a marriage of a young child happening, in an adjoining village, tried to stop it, but because of that act was brutally gang raped. So we know that in that case itself, it is under appeal and it is still going on. But one of the offshoots of that incident was that five NGOs and women's organizations got together and appealed to the Supreme Court that you should do something about a woman who's just doing her work. And in the course of her work, if she suffers this kind of backlash, this kind of violence, this kind of terrible violence, then what is the protection for women to just do their work if they get work? So the Vishaka versus State of Rajasthan guidelines were far-reaching because they opened a new kind of debate. The new kind of debate was that usually when violence against women happens, the usual response of lawmakers is that when violence happens, after it happens, what all could be done to address it? So, do we need to change the law to address it better? Do we need faster systems, so fast track courts or other things? Do we need better investigative tools, etc.? But the Vishaka guideline changed the parameter of the debate because they said that if women are working, then one should just presume that sexual harassment is taking place in that workplace. That's a big presumption to have. And, the Supreme Court suggested that the emphasis should be what to do in workplaces so that sexual harassment or any kind of sexual violence is prevented. So, what to do before sexual harassment happens, alongside what to do when sexual harassment happens. So, while the guidelines suggested that every workplace should have, a committee, the committee should be headed by a woman. It should have over 50% women. It should have external parties, external members in terms of NGOs or experts in the field who should be part of any inquiry if a complaint is received. Precisely because workplaces have a lot of hierarchy in them. Workplaces are hierarchically organized, so power equations really matter. Who is complaining against whom? Whether just an internal committee can do a fair inquiry, or does a committee really need an external member? So the Supreme Court made this suggestion about the kind of committee there should be for inquiry. But simultaneously, they said that what should be the employer's responsibility? They said it's the employer's responsibility to not just respond to incidents after they happen, but to in fact undertake continuous non-stop gender sensitization and awareness campaigns, organize workshops, do things so that the workforce is sensitized per se. Now, those who have worked on sexual harassment, how do they interpret it? That what is going on? For a long while, in a lot of feminist theory, in a lot of academic literature, it was understood that the role of women when it's confined within the domestic realm is that of a private sexual property, that there is a lot of regulation of women in terms of their sexuality. Therefore, who women meet, where they go, the interaction is minimized, and women are constrained, restricted a lot within the domestic realm. But there is also a lot of feminist literature and theory now that when women are making the transition from the domestic or the private to the public realm, that when women come out in the public realm, there is the sense that they are seen as public sexual property. That just what a lot of women face, while moving out, while going for education, while traveling to work, they are viewed that these are available women. They're not in their place. If they're outside their free game, then they're loose women. Then they are, it's a complex thing what goes on in people's minds. But the fact that there is such rampant existence of sexual harassment on the roads, in the public spaces, so much staring, so many things. But specifically in the workplace, where women are there to do work, and they really want to be assessed in terms of the work they do. But if they are still seen through the male sexual gaze, if they are seen essentially as sexualized beings, they are sexualized, or they are seen in the workplace primarily assessed through, how they are sexually, then it can be very reducing. It can be very debilitating. It can be very humiliating for women not to be assessed in terms of work, capability, skill, etc., but to be continued to be viewed through the sexualized male gaze, and to be viewed as primarily sexual beings. Now, of course, the Vishaka guidelines of the Supreme Court suggested that This has adverse impact not just on women's capacity to work or capability to work, but it also has a very adverse impact on their health, on their sense of safety, on their sense of security. If colleagues around them, their peers, their seniors who have power, continue to look at them as public sexual property, as available women, as women who are sexual in nature and no other way to look at women, then it can be very reductive and very humiliating, and it can have very debilitating impact on mental health, on sense of safety, on sense of security of women. So in 2012-13, when this big gang rape movement broke out, then it was young people who demanded that this law, which was a guideline, should be enacted by Parliament as a necessary, compulsorily implemented kind of law. That it should not be left to the discretion of workplaces to choose whether they want to, have workplaces which are sensitive to women, or at least have within their mandated, goals of building workplace culture, because all workplaces have a certain kind of culture. They have different kinds of cultures. So people demanded that this should be made into a law. Now, please notice that one of the very remarkable things that why this was happening, and I will go into some details a bit later, but there is a very, very interesting paradox of women and work in India. And that paradox is that if one looks at women and normally female labor participation rates, normally who works, the labor force is divided into four types, four groups. So one is the group of illiterate persons, one is the group of middle level educated persons, one is the group of secondary education, those who have up to that level. And then there is graduate and above. So I'm sure you know that in our country's entire population, just over, a little over 8% are graduates and above. Both males and females, or, those who belong to the same family. So the grandparents are graduates and above, parents are graduates and above. Now young people are graduates and above. So it may be, it's just the net population, just about, just a little over 8% are graduates and above. Now the interesting paradox in India is that if one looks at illiterate women, their worker participation ratio, their labor force participation rate in India is about 18.5%. For middle level educated, it's about 25%. For secondary education and above, it's about 12%. And I won't ask you to guess what it is for graduates and above. But the paradox is that for graduates and above among women, it's just over 5%. So very few educated women actually work. So that's the overall. So it's a U-shaped curve. It's a reverse U. So for graduates and above, it's the least. They work the least. Now in Delhi, the city where this anti-gang rape movement broke out, that's the only difference in India. That in Delhi, graduates and above among women work a lot more than elsewhere in India. So their worker participation ratio is relatively high. So one knows that in a city like Delhi, for quite some time now, women have been coming out for education, women have been coming out for work. And if one looks at that movement per se, then a lot of women were coming out to work. Their family members realized. So many people have written about it and assessed that that movement was not about many kinds of sexual violence and many kinds of violence that women face, because women face maximum amount of violence from people they know. So over 90% of the rape cases, over 90% of the sexual violence, over 90% of, violence that women face and 90% is a conservative figure, the figures actually go up to as high as 95, and 97% is from known persons. So within families, neighbors, acquaintances, work colleagues, etc. So this stranger violence is a very, very rare phenomenon. So of course we know that in our public domain, the the popular conversation or the democratic conversation has not really gone in the direction of discussing violence by persons in close proximity, because that's what women face the most. We are still discussing that 3 or 4 or 5% of violence by strangers. That's at the most that we are willing to discuss. And in the anti-gang rape movement, people say that that movement, why so many people came out, was to claim, some stake, some, right for women to public spaces. That entire movement saw a consensus among generations, among men and women, among parents and younger people, that let women be there in the public space, because I don't think that it can be reversed too much, that women are being pushed back into the home. So at least in Delhi, there is a sense that women should be out, and should be out safely. Now, there's a logic to why sexual harassment of women at the workplace also was a fallout of this movement. Now, when women face it, we know that post the entire Me Too movement that broke out a couple of years back, post the Hollywood expose of Weinstein, and then subsequently so many others, we know that a very, very big conversation has taken place, because what was the conversation about Hollywood? It was a conversation essentially about sexual violence, sexual harassment at the workplace, because for many of those actresses, many of those professionals, working meant meeting people, meant meeting Henry Weinstein, and the fact that they faced it. And sexual harassment at the workplace is understood in broadly in terms of two categories. One category is called quid pro quo, that means a favor for a favor, and the other category is understood as hostile work environment, where you work in a very, very hostile environment, which is in terms of gender, in terms of sexuality, in terms, it is very, very hostile to you. Uh, you know, so quid pro quo is, asking, suggesting that I will offer you a favor if you do me this sexual favor, or the threat of treatment, which means that if you don't give me this favor, then this is how I will adversely affect your work. So the difference between sexual harassment that women face on the streets, which also is very difficult to confront, which also is not something that is often, or talked about too much, but the difference between that and this is that both involve a lot of thinking by women in terms of what are the consequences, but in the workplace, there are very real fears of detrimental impact on work. You know, people genuinely fear that they may lose work, they may not get a promotion, they may get transferred to, an area where, which is not what they want to do, or which is where, they will not be able to work properly. So there may be various impacts. So there is a real threat of adverse impact. So apart from all the social concerns, that affect women in, who generally face sexual harassment, the difference here is that there is an additional component, that the work may just go. And now we know that within India, what is the bulk of the workforce like? Bulk of the workforce is not in the organized workplace. It is in the unorganized workplace, where it's not like people are going to a stable workplace, have a stable employer, and a job that's continuing. That's very, very less than 5%, less than 7, 8% of the total people who are employed, the assessment is that over 90%, people say 93%, some people say even more, are in the unorganized sector. That means people change their work, or their employers change all the time, or they don't have a steady employer. So, for instance, in agricultural work, which continues to be the main area where women are employed in terms of sheer numbers, the bulk of women in India continue to work as agricultural labor. This is seasonal work. They're not working throughout the year as agricultural labor. They're working for some time, so this time they may work as laborer in XYZ field, and then, a couple of months later, or in the next cycle, or the next season when the crop is coming out, which may be a couple of months later or maybe a year later, then they're working in another field, so there's another person who's employing them. So this idea of, very stable employer there, or for instance, a lot of women who are employed in urban areas, which is also what is called feminization of labor, that women are getting work that is seen as feminine work. So a lot of women work as domestic help, as domestic workers. So they are doing work that is traditionally assigned to women in terms of cooking, washing, cleaning. These are seen as, in many ways, feminine virtues that women who don't or who can't do these things are somehow lacking. So a lot of women are constantly sort of trained by families and mothers into having all these nice qualities and nice skills, set of skills to run the house. So women getting work in domains which are, people have said that it's the services sector have come up. So a lot of women are getting work in, work which has been called, feminine work. So not much is changing in terms of, the kind of work that they do inside their homes, or the kind of work that they're expected to do outside their homes. Now, when all this is going on, when it's unorganized work, when bulk of the women are not in the organized sector, then of course the protections of sexual harassment in terms of employers matter. So when the law was made, it debated, and it has, components of, the capacity to address complaints by women who may be employed in the unorganized sector. So every district is supposed to have a district, or what is called a local complaints committee, where women who work in unorganized sector can just go and complain, who don't have an employer, who don't have an organized workplace, which is having a committee, where they can go internally and complain. So that option is there. And there are protections like that, at least 3 months' wages will be guaranteed. If women complain, it shouldn't be the case that they lose their job immediately. So if somebody is working in somebody's house and goes and lodges a complaint, the next day that person throws them out, still there are protections that at least 3 months' wages have to be given. And yet, this is a very, very complex domain, as I said earlier, because women have to think a lot about the consequences, the social consequences. And social consequences are that we still, in 2013 itself, the Justice J.S. Verma committee report said that when it comes to sexual violence, we are still arbiters of honor and shame. The women who raise issues of having faced sexual violence in any way are those who are seen as shameless, and women who don't raise complaints are seen as dignified. Of course, we have social training, which tells women all the time that don't speak out, just ignore. If you're facing unwanted sexual advances, just ignore them. There's no reason, there's no need to go ahead and say something or do something about them. So of course all those social issues are there, but these are what are there. Now, of course, within the workplace, women have issues in terms of, differential wages. We know worldwide that for the same work, women still get paid far less. We know that in terms of barriers, there are double burden of work that a lot of women still face, which is that when they go out to work, they have to continue to do domestic work, complete all the care work that they do inside the home, and then go out and work, because otherwise they'll be blamed for being bad mothers or, bad wives. So those additional pressures are there, which we can perhaps discuss more.
Thank you, Professor. That was a very enriching answer. Of course, all of the questions are interconnected, so some of what you've said will be followed up in other answers as well. If I could move on to the next question. Despite shifts and emphasis on female education and empowerment, India ranks low in terms of women participating in the labor market, as seen through the United Nations rankings such as the Gender Development Index and Gender Inequality Index. What are the challenges women face when entering the workforce within India?
I think the principal challenge that women are facing is that this expectation, and as I said earlier, women do 2/3 of the world's work. So, what is the work that they're doing? If they're doing bulk of the world's work and getting only 1/10 of the world's wages, it means they're doing a lot of work which is unpaid work. So they don't do work that they get paid for. Now, of course, so I think the biggest hindrance for that, for women working, number one is the entire idea that women are not supposed to work. They're not supposed to work for wages. They're just supposed to work in homes. Now, we have seen a lot of people across generations and even today say that this is just a division of labor between males and females. Look, the male works outside, earns the money, and provides, and the female takes care of the home. But we know that this division of labor is very, very weird because, you know, the male who's working outside has access to political power, has access to economic power, has access to many things. So constraining women within the home is not just an equal division of labor in any way. And of course, we know that there are gendered notions. So, for instance, professional cooks are mostly males. They get paid for it, and yet there is an idea that if women don't cook, then they are very, very, bad. So, for instance, just let's look at one example. Supposing there's a workplace and there are two men who just take out a knitting and start knitting during a break and start doing work like embroidery. Of course they'll be made a lot of fun of, and people will say they're not man enough, they're not masculine enough. But if what a lot of men do in many offices, which is that if it's a winter time and a sunny afternoon, they take out cards and start playing during lunch. If two women take out cards and say chalo ek tash ki bazi ho jaye, all the people around will say what bad characters they are. So there are so many double standards in terms of how we assess men and women. So the fact that there is this idea that women should stay inside the homes, and while it is changing, many are arguing that the increased violence against women is in fact a very, very adverse patriarchal backlash to women coming out of their homes. That there's a lot of anger about it. There's a lot of desire to put women in their place and remind them that they are meant for sex and nothing else. That this is who they are, and let them not think of themselves as anything else. Of course, in India, there are additional complications which add to the cultural question. We know that over 60% of young women in India still get married off under the legal age of 18 years. So over 60% get married by that age. So this idea that, girls are growing up, they should just be married. So they should be either daughters, or they should be wives, or they should be mothers, or they should be sisters, but not have an independent identity of their own. So despite so many so much, progress, advancement in the status of women, we know the facts speak for themselves, that the majority of the women are just getting married off. There is no other role that is being seen for women except to take care of families, to just get married. And this is all illegal, or anti-legal at least, the fact that these are all underage marriages. So the fact that I think the biggest hindrance is just the idea that women are not supposed to work, and if they go out to work, there is a lot of unease about them. It's a difficult thing to work and not play the traditional, gendered roles. On the other hand, there is, in terms of sheer economy, and I'm not an economics expert, but one knows that if there is general unemployment, if the unemployment levels are high, then women, for them to compete, to stay in work is all the more difficult. So if employment is, if gainful employment is available relatively more easily, then a lot more women will work. But if it's not available that easily, if there's a lot of competition, a lot of unemployment, then it becomes very, very difficult. So both from the idea of traditional notions, customary notions of what women are supposed to be, as well as those who are willing to step out, wanting to step out, but then not finding work or not finding gainful work, not finding the kind of work that will be commensurate with their skill sets, and therefore feeling that, this is not work that I can do. So that is also a very, very big hindrance.
Interestingly, Professor, when you mentioned competition, there's also the idea of women competing against each other in order to at least get some sort of a professional job or a certain level of employment, instead of cooperating or perhaps collaborating with each other to uplift women as a whole rather than individually. So I find that particularly interesting itself, that it sort of creates a process of elimination, because for the men at least, because when women are competing together, someone's always left out to the benefit of men.
Yeah, in fact, I used to work in a women's rights organization for a couple of years. And during that time, I used to work in the legal aid clinic where women would come with, problems of domestic violence. And the focus of many women in terms of their complaints used to be the mother-in-laws, the sister-in-laws, and not the husbands. Even though they would describe that the husband is beating me, but they would say at the prompting of the mother-in-law. My sense is that there are two generations of women that we can find in our country, working women that we can find in our country right now. So the first generation of professional working women sort of bore the double burden of work, which is that they'd completed entire set of domestic work and then stepped out to work and then still remained very, very guilty that they have somehow, they are being selfish if they're working, they're not being good mothers, not being good wives, not being good homemakers. So very, very painful process of work. And still many of them established the credibility of women's work in the field, amidst men. And yet for those women, one entire generation of women, the idea that somehow they're equal to men or that they're competing vis-a-vis men never really came around. Now that a second generation of women is coming out to work, they are following in the footsteps of the first generation, but are also having certain, certain ways, having it slightly easier, not being the trailblazers. But they are, encountering a different dynamics. They feel we are as good as men. We can do anything that men do. And even within the domestic realm, they are expecting men to share in domestic work. They are expecting men to also take a burden of cooking and, taking care of the household. So very different kind of demands that women are making, because mentally they are thinking. So those who are in that space where they're thinking of themselves, at least aspirationally, as equal to men, wanting to be equal to men, their fights at the domestic level or their workplace professional competitions are with men. But otherwise, it's just, let me be more important for the husband than the other woman, than the wife, than the mother in law, than the sister in law. Or in the workplace, we can't even think of competing with men or being as good as men. We can just only go as high or as we can be as good as, being better than the other woman. So, I think that both of these are very much there in terms of how they are playing out. Of course, we know that the figures for domestic violence for professional women in nuclear families are also increasing. The National Family Health Survey, the third one especially showed in great detail that over 37% of women in the country were facing domestic violence, and a lot of them from highly educated families, as well as working women. So it's a strange paradox that if women make more demands of men, then the men get angry. If women compete with other men and say value me more than other women, then also men get angry. So it's a very complex domestic to professional relationships that women have to negotiate, unfortunately. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor. So I'll move on to the next question. In your understanding, do you believe that an emphasis on girl child education will cause a rise in the number of women in the labor market? With an increase in access to education, will women be provided with more career opportunities? Will the structural prejudice shatter or decline to a large extent due to access to education? And I'd just like to say this is really interesting because you had mentioned earlier on that women who have had access to tertiary education actually don't prefer or do not get to work when compared to women who have received limited amount of education. So I think that this is a very interesting paradox, as you mentioned.
Yes, in 1970s, early 1970s, this was just after independence, and we know that there was a very, very interesting debate between social reformers and political reformers as India's freedom struggle evolved. So many people said that we should do social reform vis-a-vis gender and caste. We should give priority to that. Rather than getting freedom from the British, and others who said we should first get freedom from the British, and the other issues we will address, simultaneously. But it was just a matter of according priority, and that remains a debate in terms of, even in contemporary times. So when India became free, of course, the expectation of a lot of people was that, now everything will be fine. The British are gone. Now everybody will be happy. So it took about over 2 decades after independence for the feminist movement to start coming up, for women to once again, as citizens, start discussing that now, we have self-rule, we are ruled by our own elected representative, but the situation of women is not improving. So there was a status of women report, a historic report that was brought out in the early 70s. And among the various discussions that happened after that, one was that education should be gender sensitive. Now, I would, keep on emphasizing the merits of education, because education is extremely valuable. It does a lot in terms of broadening the horizons of people, giving people access to thinking about things. And yet our education is in some ways and in many ways extremely gendered, because it also tells us how to be good men and women, in very, very subtle ways through what all we study. So the fact that, graduate women and above, those who are educated up to graduate levels and above, opt for work the least means that somewhere in their training, either in classes that are far more propertied, that have a lot more stake, because the confining of women to the domestic realm has always been, by one strain of thinking linked to property. That if there is a property to be passed on to the progeny, We know that, technology for, DNA testing, for paternity tests have just come up now. Otherwise, apart from the mother, who knows who's the father of the child if women are freely interacting with other men. So a lot of the policing of women, moral policing, their movement, policing of women, confining of women, has come out of this obsession of, ensuring that women do not interact with anybody, in terms of, don't have the scope to interact sexually with anybody, so that there can be an assurance that the progeny is mine, in terms of, and therefore it can be passed off. So people have analyzed this phenomena both in terms of, a greater anxiety about women's sexuality to be controlled in the more propertied classes, who are, obviously more inclined to have their daughters educated. And there is the other way, which is that women who are getting education are somehow getting so deeply ingrained in gender roles, that even after attaining such high levels of or high levels of education, the more suitable role for them is not to go out and work, but to take care of the house. So it's a very, very strange paradox. And from 70s, people have been demanding reform education, make it gender sensitive, change school textbooks drastically, change how women are taught, and what they are taught, and what men are taught, and what people study and what they understand by education. So this paradox still exists. So, I'm all for education of women, but one knows that that doesn't automatically translate into labor market and work. And of course, if one has to incentivize, because there are many times, people say liberal elites and whatnot, in today's times, there's a lot of resentment against people who are educated, that they think of too much of themselves, because there are so many gaps between people who have access to higher education and so few people have access to it, and they are often the same generation getting it over and over again, and very few first generation sort of people coming into higher education, so whose parents have not studied ever. They're the first ones from their families or from their villages or from their towns to sort of come out and get into that level of higher education. So those numbers are still very few, but it's happening, especially with Dalit, with Adivasi, with backward communities. And yet that progress is very, very slow. So, my sense is that either, if one can sort of think about it, then one has to think in terms of incentivizing people who study to be able to do work. But we know that the highest unemployment level, that means people, how is unemployment calculated? It's not just those who are not working, but it's in terms of those who want to work but are not getting work. One knows that the highest unemployment levels are also among the graduates and above, because when people get a certain level of education, they expect a certain kind of work. It's very difficult to be a graduate and do many other kinds of work. And in our country, given caste system and given many notions of looking down upon work, which is physical work, therefore, there are very sort of again cultural notions about if I have studied so much, then I should get a desk job and not any other kind of job, or I should get a job where I'm working on a laptop, or something of that kind. So there are very complex reasons for why so much education doesn't translate into work for women, and the people who are highly educated are having the highest levels of having to compete for work, because they are having the highest levels of unemployment in the country. They want work but are not getting it. So of course they want certain kind of work, and it is not unfair to expect certain kind of work. So if I give you an anecdote, let me tell you that what a complex question gender is in work. For a couple of years, I was working in Delhi among home-based workers. Now, home-based workers are it is assessed that they are second largest in number for women's work, after agricultural work. So in the non-agricultural sector, the maximum number of women are home-based workers. Now, who are these women, who are home-based workers? They are women, they're not domestic workers. Domestic workers are different. They go out of their homes and work. So a lot of work which has been contractualized and subcontractualized and, outsourced. So outsourcing is not just an international phenomenon, it's a domestic phenomenon as well. We know that a lot of production units in Delhi, because that's a city I'm aware of, at one point of time because of pollution, a lot of factories closed down, they moved out. And then what happened to their work? A lot of work got contracted and subcontracted to women who had never worked before. So one contractor will come and say, you just wash 144 parts of this, automobile with acid. You just wash 144 and we'll give you 10 rupees, or, and we'll give it to your home. We'll give it inside your home. You work there. Or, we are bringing this garment to you. All you have to do is stitch buttons. In this lane, 100 women are just stitching buttons. If you stitch 144 buttons, we'll give you 2 rupees, or, and those are the kind of rates. So, with the survey that I was part of, that we did about 10 years back, women were making after 16 hours of average work within the home, because they're always, it's called piece rate work, number of pieces, number of units that they complete, they get paid on the basis of that. So from mobile work to embroidery to, garment related work to screwing something in, for electronic gadgets, to all kinds of work has come to women who have never worked before. Now, home-based workers, because they don't go out to work, because, for 3 months they may be making rakhis, then for another 3 months they may be painting diyas, then for another 3 months they may be doing embroidery, and then for 3 months they may have no work, and then for the next 2 months they may get a work which is all about very sophisticated automobile or electronic equipment which they have to do something with. So they're not employed permanently, they have long periods of unemployment, so the government doesn't count them as workers. And because these are women who have never worked before, so never sold their labor in the labor market for a wage. And they have always been doing back-breaking domestic work. So when they get, somebody comes to at their doorstep, gives them work, which they complete, and then when children come back from home and they say, let them all join in, only 10 pieces are left, you also do. And of course, their labor is not counted. They also complete to help the mother. They feel, I've made 10 rupees in a day, I've made 16 rupees in a day, I can buy milk, I can buy 1 kg of vegetable, I can give 5 rupees to my child if they ask me for some money, without having to ask of it from my husband. They feel very, very empowered because they're anyway doing back-breaking work in their homes. Now they're doing back-breaking work in their homes and making some money for the first time. So gender is a very, very complex phenomena in the workplace. Now, in many houses, we found that men had lost work. And then when women asked the men that, khali baithe hue ho, kuch haath bata lo, help me with some work. But the men have sold their labor in the marketplace for, a daily wage of 250 rupees, of 300 rupees. For them to do work that pays them 10 rupees, 15 rupees, 20 rupees is below dignity. It's just such a, so those who have worked, and that's what is called underemployment, those who have worked for a wage before, if their wage is improving, they feel good about it, even though it may be terrible wage. And those who have worked, but their wage is decreasing, they feel quite terrible about whether they would want to do that work at all or not. So of course it's legitimate for graduate women to expect certain kind of work which is not available. It's a highly competitive terrain to expect a certain kind of work and get it. And it's easier to get pushed back into the traditional customary roles of, the homemaker. So I'm all for education, but I'm also for, doing something more in terms of making more jobs available for the educated. because they are facing the toughest time. So yeah, women's horizons may broaden, but I don't know. It's a very tough pickle to explain. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much for that answer, Professor. So following up from the last question, to what extent, in your view, has the socioeconomic mindset shifted with regards to career-oriented women in India? And I ask this because the law that we had mentioned earlier on was passed relatively recently. 2013 is not a very long time ago, if we think about it. So if the legal process is somewhat slow, um, can we assume that people's mindsets have been very slow in the shift as well, or are they not directly related?
Despite this law becoming mandatory now, the fine if a workplace or a corporation doesn't have such a committee, or their committee is not doing anything, is 50,000 rupees. Now, we know for a fact that there are very few workplaces, even after the law, that are implementing the law, even for namesake. And we know that during the Me Too movement, especially among students, because universities, the first university to have the anti-sexual harassment committee called GS Cash in India was in JNU in 1999. So I was part of that first committee. So one learned a lot in the process of getting the committee formed. But after that, and within a couple of months in Delhi University, and then universities embraced these committees. And they had to do a lot of, thinking around the issue because students are technically not employees. And yet they're in a power relationship within the universities, and there are very complex peer relationships between students. So, one had to interpret who the employer is responsible towards. But the fact of the matter is that from 1997, when the Vishakha guidelines came out, to 2013, when it was university students who came out and said, just make these committees everywhere, just make them. We have seen them, we have lived with them for 10 years. Even Jindal had a committee prior to the law itself, so universities did that sort of spontaneously. And all universities had, that's a different debate, perhaps we can have it another day, had gender neutral laws. So male, female, people could, transgenders, anybody could complain. So it was not limited to women as the law limits it to women. Subsequently, the UGC had to again bring out fresh guidelines for universities and say, okay, for in universities, anybody can complain. So very, very complex history that the law itself has. But we know that even after it has become mandatory, most workplaces are just ignoring the law. Now, there have been debates about, making it part of the Companies Act, incorporating it there, that for a company to exist, it has to have such a because those are very, very, those require a lot of strict compliance. But we know that from the commerce and other ministries, there have been resistance. We know that there's backlash after Me Too, people saying that if women raise these issues too much, they're not going to be employed. Their employment is going to suffer even more. So we know that women's employment has been suffering since then. But it will be very complex statistically to be able to establish that this is the reason why. That women have started losing employment. It's very complex, because our unemployment levels are anyway going up. So it's a very complex relationship, but we know that there is a patriarchal backlash to assertive career women. People expect, and it's a very complex question. Just look at a university. We have student feedback of teachers' performance, and there was once a time when a lot of female teachers got together and we discussed among ourselves that how do students accept our authority? How do they look at us? If we get angry, do they take it? Or do they get really upset? How does it go? And as we were exchanging our sort of notes, we found that the students assess us overwhelmingly in terms of our personalities and our sense of care. So very few teachers, female teachers, get feedback from students which are about female teachers' intellectual capacities. but a lot of teachers, female teachers, get feedback that they're very nice, that they're very sweet, that they're very bad mannered. So that teachers, female teachers, are expected to do care work while take care of their students, whereas male teachers are not to that extent. Or if they're assessed, they're like how intellectual, how dazzling, in terms of their mental capacities. So it's a gender is a very, very complex terrain. So for women, you are saying, for women who are career oriented, that means they would want to give priority to their career, or give a lot of importance to their career. uh, they are still battling very complex issues in terms of both their domestic realms, both their relationships with family and friends, as well as in the workplace. So a lot of negative stereotypes do get attached to women, and yet despite that, we have women breaking the glass ceiling everywhere, all the time, managing to do things which just managing to do things with a lot of disadvantages with them, but managing to do things that break new grounds for other women. So that is also happening. There are lots of positive stories in terms of what women are doing.
Thank you, Professor. So now we can perhaps shift to what we can do to make sure that women face less trouble within the workplace, within their desire to actually get a job. So the next question is linked to this itself. Could you please elaborate on the work efforts undertaken to help women enter the workforce? How often do you find such efforts to be implemented, or are they solely present on paper? Instead, what measures do you personally believe should be implemented to help such women?
You see, frankly, everybody who wants work should get it. But we know that, people have different challenges in terms of working. Women have more, Dalit women have even more, Adivasi women have even more, Muslim women are facing a lot of backlash. They're seen as very, very threatening and dangerous women, potentially terrorists all the time. So there are very, very complex things that are happening, and I know that the Prime Minister has a very, very good slogan. Beti Bachao and Beti Padhao. The emphasis is on educating daughters. But we know that the slogan came up as soon as the NDA 2 government came in power in 2014, and right before 2015 were the communal riots in UP, in Muzaffarnagar. And the slogan there, because that's where the boogie of love jihad started getting raised, was Beti Bachao, Bahu Lao. So and that Beti Bachao Bahu Lao, which was instrumental in propelling the ruling party into power in UP, and then in the government, half of that was taken up, Beti Bachao and Beti Padhao. So, Beti Bachao, Bahulao, Beti Padhao, Beti Bachao. For those who see the connections, and for those who don't, it's there, for us to assess, what the continuities are between the two. I would say that this entire idea that somehow women are to be protected from dangers all around, you know, from dangerous sexually predatory men, who are outside, from access to mobile phones that will also expose them to dangerous predatory men, from going out and having a good time with friends, because that is also going to expose them to dangerous sexually predatory men. This entire obsession with somehow saving the daughters from sexual predators all around, and it gets complicated with issues of religion and community and caste. uh, if this discourse continues too much, that the big bad world is dangerous out there, it's just too dangerous for women, I think that is quite sad, in terms of being a detriment, because every incident of violence that happens outside, sends a wave of impact on individual women who are called up by their families and say, be careful, don't go out, don't wear this, don't do that, don't do that, and 101 restrictions get circulated immediately on women. So it is a very, very hostile terrain, and the solution that is being offered is not the sexual harassment, the workplace solution, which is increased gender sensitization, take awareness campaigns, take measures to improve the numbers of women, and the work conditions for women. Rather than that, the remedy still is, let's protect women, let's save them, let's keep them under certain restrictions, let us not let them use their minds, but let us think for them. So if those cultural norms continue, I think it makes it very difficult for women to break out into the public realm, which is supposedly not for them. So they are in not in a place where they ought to be, and then do good work. It makes the terrain hostile for women. So of course, as I said earlier, that if there could be policies that companies that have better diversity in terms of gender, employers who do better in terms of gender diversity, because there's enough studies around the world to say more diverse workplaces means more diverse viewpoints and better decision making because of the diversity of viewpoints. And more of the same means they don't get contrarian views, they get surprised later, when something happens which they didn't take into account. So of course, if there could be incentives for such places, such workplaces, such employers. But as I'm telling you, that the sexual harassment law, which is now mandatory, the Commerce Ministry is not willing to make it into a mandatory part of the Companies Act so far. So there's a huge resistance from employers, and they are just saying, you make it mandatory and will not employ women. So those are the dynamics, public dynamics, and that kind of tug of rope, kind of push and pulls that are going on. So it's a complex one. So I don't have easy remedies because I don't see that happening. I see rather the trend to be obsessively about protecting women from so many dangers outside. That I think that is only going to, sort of make it more tough for women to step out. So I'm not very optimistic, but of course, women have started stepping out, and the numbers have increased temporarily. Right now, we know till last year they started decreasing over the couple of past few years. Let's see what happens post pandemic. Many were optimistic, and many people said that the pandemic, when the entire world is at a standstill, and will lead to people valuing care work like never before, because women are now running the world. Running the world. They are doing entire domestic work. They're doing managing the entire house. Nothing else but that care work is continuing, and it will lead to a lot of valuation of that. But I think the jury is still out whether women have improved their status post the pandemic, or has it just become worse despite their shouldering the burden of the world's economy for a couple of months now. You know, so it's a terrain where women still have to fight and find ways for themselves still.
It's interesting, because Professor, you brought up different levels of identity and how they play a role. It's not just the issue of gender, but the quote unquote double disadvantage with regards to religion or your caste and how that impacts women as well. And about the pandemic, so we're actually looking at how the pandemic has affected women as well. We looked at domestic abuse with during the pandemic and other such issues. So yeah, I totally understand why you're a little skeptical of what the outcome would be, considering that these issues continue despite people saying otherwise. But thank you so much, Professor. That's all the questions. It's been a very enriching experience, and thank you for explaining it so nicely, all of the concepts, all of the answers. I hope that everyone takes away something from it when they see this on YouTube. But thank you once again for participating as our guest speaker for this month's Awaaz in Focus.
Thank you so much, Natasha. Because I'm a professor, I suffer from that 2 hour or 2.5 hour class syndrome. So, thank you for sort of keeping me within. I've still exceeded time, but keeping me in some control. So, thank you for the excellent questions and for this opportunity.